Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and this week on the Roundup, we're going to be answering three questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. It's the last roundup before the presidential elections next Tuesday, so we'll be answering a question related to that. We'll look at some survey data on how international students are changing destinations or considering multiple destinations in their applications these days. And we'll look at how India and Canada, their ongoing political rifts are potentially impacting future Indian student interest in studying in Canada, on top of all the other changes that the Canadian government has put in place. So those are the three questions we're going to be answering today. And like we do each week, we take our questions we answer here on Wednesday from our newsletter that comes out on Monday. That newsletter, called All the SMIE News Fit to Share, is put out in a couple different formats, in email format, which you can subscribe to through our website. I'm dropped the link to that in the chat at smieconsulting.org/subscribe. You scroll down to the subscribe button, and then you can enter your name, institution, and email address, and we'll get that to you every Monday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. The alternative option is getting it via LinkedIn. If you prefer to get your international ed news that way, we're happy to have you get it. Be more than one of the 2,100 subscribers that are receiving their information, international education information from our newsletter through LinkedIn. So we're really happy to have you as part of the conversation on Mondays. And when we look at those news stories, we give you our hot takes on Monday in the newsletter. We look at for themes that we see developing in some of the news stories, and then focus a question around those three topics to go more in depth, go next level, and kind of talk through how these stories and the questions they raise can impact what you do in international education in terms of your strategic planning, in terms of your focus within a particular region, within your messaging out to prospective students. We'll look at all of those kinds of questions and go into those more in detail here on the Wednesday roundups. So let's dive straight into the first question, and that is, why do international students not care a lot about who the U.S. president is? And there's been a lot of news stories recently about student surveys going back to the 2016 elections of who would you prefer if Donald Trump were elected or at the time Hillary Clinton were elected. And overwhelmingly, it seemed that international students then were much more in favor of Hillary Clinton being elected than Donald Trump. Donald Trump had many more negatives associated with his candidacy than Hillary Clinton. Yet, and that was the mood then, back in 2016. In more recent surveys around the election this go-round, before President Biden dropped out of the running for re-election, the surveys were about the same in terms of who favored who more, and the student surveys that were coming back seemed to reflect that international students slightly preferred Biden to Trump in terms of whether that would influence their decision more or less. But the not majority, but a good percentage were kind of meh about who didn't matter to them, who was elected president. With Vice President Harris coming into the mix, obviously she presents a different perspective because she is the product of two international students. So she has obviously a very international background in her family. She tends to espouse immigration beliefs that tend to be more open to folks coming from other countries. Obviously, she had a role as the border czar, however you feel about that. That seems to be giving students the impression, at least on the public face, that she would be more open. But the reality is the numbers are not that much different for her as opposed to former President Trump about what international students prefer. You really see a lot happening with student interest these days, and that it's and some have called it, it's cynicism. The article that we're referencing is a PI News article that talks about the survey results that INTED and study portals conducted, where a significant majority did say they had a positive perception of Kamala Harris at 70%. Many students, however, quote unquote, remain indifferent to who is in the White House when making their personal decisions about their education. And it continues the quote, international students tend to prioritize and focus on their educational opportunities and personal goals without significant regard for specific political figures in office. So the end goal is, our end response is that there are one of two potential views on this. And this is from Ben Waxman, head of INTED, and he indicates that this sentiment may stem either from sense of cynicism, believing politics don't impact students' opportunities, or a strong confidence in the structural integrity of the U.S. education system and visa policies, no matter who holds office. And that's the one piece I want to hang on to and focus on for the purposes of this question's answer. You look at what happened in 2016, that showed there was definite preference amongst international students, not that they had any say in who was elected, but in terms of whether they would vote with their feet or not. We saw, even after Trump was elected in November 2016, took office January 2017, there were the famous Muslim travel bans implemented on 7 countries, even though only 5 of the 7 were Muslim majority countries. That those travel bans were, each of them, when written, had exemptions carved in for international students. And Iran was one of those. Iranian students continue to come to the United States because they're coming through third countries for their visas. So the travel bans had a lot of negative consequences for international students in the Muslim world because they felt targeted. Even though that they might not have been living in one of those countries that was subject to the ban, in effect, the negative implications, the negative damage done to the U.S.'s reputation as no longer welcoming to Muslim students was made clear through these bans. So you see what back then that was more of a consequence of the rhetoric and that came after the implementation of these bans, and the reputational damage that was done was inflamed by, well, the perception that, hey, U.S. is no longer welcome. However, that fall 2016, international student numbers 2017, international students numbers were still increasing. 2018, those numbers were still increasing. 2019, those numbers still increased. So the knock-on effect from those 2016 elections was negligible. And maybe they didn't grow as much as they might have in those 3 years, 17, 18, and 19. But you really saw that didn't impact student decision making, even though there was a lot of negative press, in significant numbers. There was already a downturn at that point in Chinese student numbers because of their declining demographics. There were political tensions anyway that carried over from the end of the Obama administration into the Trump administration, and that was a political football for a few years and still has been in the Biden administration. But actually there's been more consistency between first Trump administration and the Biden administration in terms of views on China, and there's still a lot of issues that haven't been resolved that have been around for 8, 9, 10 years. So when it comes to student interest, the political landscape, they don't obviously impact the results themselves because they can't vote. Then you see what had happened in 2020. Then you now have former President Trump running again against the vice president of the current administration, and you see similar attitudes. And the survey data reflects that 36% in the first survey back in 2016 said they had no clear preference for either candidate. That's jumped to 43% in 2024. That was back in June. So you see now that students are largely indifferent, and that's the tag for the article. So that, I think, has some implications that it doesn't really matter. That tells that these students who are making these decisions to study in the United States are doing so without consequence or without the impact of feeling the impact of who's in the White House. And we've seen that in other countries, governments can change their policies very quickly, almost on a dime. The dependent study ban came about within about a 6-month period. You've seen the Canadian visa caps implemented last year and extended this coming year. That happened fairly quickly. You saw in Australia, they're now implementing their own cap of 275,000 new international students in 2025. Those caps have not only reputational damage, but have real structural damage in terms of limits of new students coming into those countries. Whereas the travel bans, those, because they had exemptions carved out for students, it was more of a reputational risk to the country through making these travel ban statements rather than an actual risk in terms of a significant wall being put up, because there, again, were exemptions carved out for each of those 7 countries for international students. So whereas with what Canada, UK, and Australia have done, they are targeting international students and the restrictions they are putting in place. Not so the case in the US. And our policies, our visa policies, have largely remained unchanged. There have been tweaks here and there, some very positive ones by if a student visa applicant has already had a U.S. visa, maybe a visitor visa or some other visa within the last 5 years, they don't need to go through that cumbersome visa interview process and are not subject to the appointments. They just submit their documents online, and then that decision is made on their visas without having to go for an interview. So that's been a big plus. You've seen a lessening of influence in the visa approval process for consular officers in terms of instructions that have been given to be more favorable in terms of the 214B requirement that they prove non-immigrant intent. For an 18-year-old to know what they're going to do for the rest of their lives when they're finished with their degree is highly unrealistic. And consular officers have been told, whether they actually implement it or not is another question entirely, down to the individual visa officer. But the instructions have been, hey, don't put as much weight as you have been on having an 18-year-old prove that they know that they're coming home as soon as they're done with their studies or any OPT that they have available to them. So this is something that I think the U.S. system hasn't changed much for visas. In the process is still the same. The DS-160 is the same, has been for many years. The price might go up here and there, and depending on which country, and there may be additional fees. But largely, that process for applying for a student visa to the United States is the same, and it isn't impacted by who's in the White House. So to change that, we all know in the United States there's a huge need for immigration reform, and it really hasn't happened since the 1980s, so well over 40 years, almost 40 years since we've had significant, I think 1987, 88 was the last time we had significant immigration reform in the United States. Since that time, almost 40 years, that system has remained in place, and that's been consistent. We know that those travel bans that we were talking about earlier, they were implemented by the executive branch. Even though there were exemptions carved out for international students, eventually those bans were overturned, and that were declared illegal by the Supreme Court, the U.S. court system. So you now have a system in place, a checks and balances system that the U.S. is famous for, that when there are, even in this case, egregious overreaches by the government, executive branch, in terms of executive orders that were put in place, the courts came in and eventually overturned those. So there is always that checks and balance that impacts the integrity positively of the U.S. system. And that perhaps is what gives students that confidence to continue to apply to the United States, regardless of what other consequences these potential changes might have, whoever's in the White House. So I think we really have a lot to be thankful for in terms of our system as in the United States. That is very different than what's happening in other countries. Our country has failed to deal with immigration reform in the last almost 40 years. And other countries are having to deal with that because they have existential threats to services and overburdening healthcare, housing, other services that these rushes of new students have had in their countries. So we are in a unique position in the United States. I think there's many more positives that we don't talk enough about the U.S. system in our messaging out to students. We're so focused institutionally on what our university is strong at, what our college values are, our unique selling points. We're so focused on that, we forget about everything else about the United States that is of real value to future students coming in from overseas. So that's why I think international students are a little bit meh about who's in the White House, because our system really protects the integrity of the process of applying to the United States, the visas that they can get. That process is remaining fairly consistent. Now let's move on to the second question, and that is, does it really matter that international students are considering multiple destinations and even changing destinations based on different criteria that are changes that governments are making around the world? So this is a somewhat similar question to our first one about the U.S. presidential elections and international student views. But here we're talking about some very significant differences in how students around the world are really changing their habits in terms of where they're applying. We've seen studies over the last few years that show that international students are applying to a greater range of countries. So that in the past you have students, I'm just looking at UK universities, or I'm just looking at US or Canadian or Australian universities. Very rarely would you see students that would be applying to multiple countries at once. I had an interesting conversation with a guidance counselor. She wanted to do an interview with me for a book she's planning to write in the next couple of years. She's a young, energetic millennial guidance counselor at an international school in Guangzhou, China. And she had the idea to do this because, and she came out of that the interview she did with me with a perspective on why she was asking me about other countries and influences in applying changes in government policies and all that. And her comments to me really hit home because it reflects the reality on the ground, even in an international school, that students that she's advising are now applying to the UK, Canada, Australia. Some are even who are in China there or applying to Chinese universities. They might be applying to the US or maybe Hong Kong or Singapore or other regional hubs. So what's ended up happening for her in her role, instead of just maybe focusing on the big four English language speaking destinations, she's now having to become an expert or at least knowledgeable in the admissions processes in 10 to 15 different countries where her students are applying every year. And she remarked, I have some students who are applying to multiple countries. So that's a huge shift over the last probably 5 to 10 years in international student behavior. And that whether they're at an international school, whether they're national students, they have many more viable options available to them in terms of where they can go. And this matters, or should matter, to U.S. institutions, because we ask yourself the question, if a student is applying to your institution, and you might be one of 2, 3 U.S. schools that they're applying to, they might be applying to a British university, a Canadian university, an Australian university, maybe even a Chinese university. Is what you send them in terms of your ComFlow messaging, in terms of your marketing points, unique selling points, are you only focusing on, again, the same unique selling points that you have for your institution that apply to international students? If you even distinguish between your domestic unique selling points and your international unique selling points, and yes, there should be different, and probably aren't. But if they are different, are they those unique selling points just your institutional ones? Are you not taking into consideration the benefits of the United States as a selling point for international students? When you talk about the extended work permission that students have in STEM programs, the diversity of our campuses, the capacity of our campuses for housing that most other universities around the world are having. And when you can think about these things, Think about how you message in terms of the context of what's happening in other countries so that you're aware, you know, or if you listen to the Roundup and get our newsletter, you know other countries are significantly restricting their incoming international student populations. We don't have those restrictions in the United States. Talk about that as a benefit. Talk about the STEM work permission that they have. Talk about the housing and the campus communities that we all say are unique to our universities, but reality is campus communities are how the majority of U.S. colleges are set up, as living, learning, residential communities. Most other universities around the world can't say that. That's a unique selling point about the United States, not just your institution, but about the United States. Talk about the diverse range of institutions, the diversity of our country, geographically, climatologically, culturally, socially, economically. All of those components make up who our campuses are as diverse landscapes and representations of America, and if not the world. So are we selling those things to future students? To say to a student who is looking at 2 or 3 different countries, maybe they're looking at the US, Canada, Australia, if we can say to that student in messaging, hey, we're a country that has open borders, well, maybe not that in that particular language, but open arms for international students. If you're admitted, you meet our visa requirements, you can come. We're not putting restrictions. Our country is not putting restrictions on the numbers of students that can come. That's a message that will resonate because they hear it, because they're applying to these other countries or thinking about applying to these other countries. The messaging you put out that reflects, yes, wow, yeah, not only this is a great institution, but they're in a country that isn't restricting me. And if I'm reinforcing that message that the U.S. is not restricting, that the U.S. has all these other benefits that other countries can't offer or can't guarantee, that will resonate. So if that's not part of your messaging strategy right now, and most institutions don't get that level of sophistication, and that maybe is a drop-in email that you have out, it's a social media message you're sending out to prospective students during your live events or any video content you put out. We're selling not only our university, but we're talking about the values of the United States as a destination for international students. Are you doing that? I'll challenge you to prove it if you are. But those are things that we really hope or to really distinguish yourself in the marketplace, in the messaging you're putting out there. Are you making those efforts to convince your future students that, hey, it's not just us that's a great destination as an institution, it's the United States. Are you making those distinctions in your messaging? So it does matter that international students are considering multiple destination countries for where they study and are willing to change if the restrictions that they're putting in place in certain countries that they might have been considering are too onerous. And it's like, well, they don't really want us there anymore, do they? So it's not just the reputational damage that matters, but those physical barriers that matter to future students. More so probably the physical barriers that are put in place. So that's our second question. The last one is really going into the kind of a microcosm of everything we've just talked about here. And is the Canada-India political rift, permanently damaging future student interest in studying in Canada? There are a couple of articles I'll be sharing here. First one up is from an article talking about the diplomatic row between Canada and India. There's been diplomats that have been expelled on both sides. You've seen sharp drop in interest and this article is from an Indian publication that shows up to, I think that the visa numbers are, I think, fairly consistent, have been going down in recent years, but recent months, that right now there's in the cap on that Canada put in place this year that has been basically a 35% drop in overall international students admitted for 2024. That when you look at the actual numbers that we're hearing from a lot of the agents on the ground, we are seeing that a 70% decline exists now in interest. And this doesn't bode well for the future, in interest from students in India seeking higher education in Canada. So talk about structural barriers put in place on top of the reputational damage being done with the diplomatic rift between India and Canada. And again, if you're not familiar, it's over the assassination of a Sikh separatist who is a Canadian national, and the Canadian government has said they have evidence tying the Indian government to that assassination. So that has flared, and it's been going on for well over a year now. Abhijit Zaveri, a founder of Career Mosaic, told the Indian publication, that there is now a noticeable decline in student interest in pursuing education in Canada. And that's influenced largely by the ongoing diplomatic situation between the two countries. And their 70% number that Abhijit referenced is from the students that they placed in Canada in 2021, about 1,000, down to a drop in 2024 of 70%. To just 300, and they're saying that that number will decline even further to about 200 students in 2025. So significant damage being done in India-Canada relationships politically. It's had a carry-on effect onto student interest on top of the barriers that the government had already put in place to limit the number of new students, regardless of where they were from, coming to Canada. So what we're seeing is political barriers, political debates on immigration can fly, and words can be used that are inflammatory and certainly have been on all sides. But we're seeing in Canada the actual concrete diplomatic action, expulsions of diplomats, has added to the impact of the immigration-related changes that the Canadian government has already put in place. So that's all we have for you today on the Roundup. We really appreciate you being a part of the conversation. And if you haven't already, get out there and vote. Next week, I'll be in Malaysia for an event through one of our agent partners at UNLV GSM, Global Student Mobility, in Penang, Malaysia all week. So I've already voted, so looking forward to those results, positively or negatively. But will it really matter? That's the question. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and we wish you all the very best. Cheers.